The deepest and most important questions in international relations have always revolved around issues of war and peace. But what exactly do those words mean in 2020? Aren't we dealing with a problem of blurred lines? Today we're going to be looking at the incredibly impressive book with an extremely long title, How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything, Tales from the Pentagon by Rosa Brooks. So Rosa Brooks is a professor at Georgetown Law School and had worked for the Obama administration as a counselor in the Department of Defense. However, she's perhaps become more famous in recent years because of her regular appearances on the Deep State Radio podcast. Along with Ed Luce of the Financial Times, Brooks is my favourite guest on that show, and the reason why I think that, which also speaks to what, in my view, makes her book so worthwhile reading, is that she doesn't seem to have a problem with accepting that modern politics, be it at the national or international level, is full of ambiguity, murkiness, and unsolved riddles, because it reflects the myriad complexities of the contemporary human condition. In other words, politics is murky and muddy because our lives and our societies are murky and muddy. Even though she was part of the Obama administration, she's not particularly interested in defending it. And although she's critical of George W. Bush,
I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
And since he's come to office, she's been overtly critical of the Donald Trump administration. She's also critical of the Democrats.
See, have the Democrats being kind of gutless on this is not particularly surprising.
So what is this book about? Well, at its heart, it's an analysis of the problem I introduced at the beginning. The traditional distinction between war and peace has broken down, and because of that, our legal system and societal norms are no longer necessarily fit to cope in the modern world. This may seem a little bit ephemeral, but if we walk through an example, that might make it clearer. For most of us who haven't seen combat in our lifetimes, we might think of what war looks like through the lens that Hollywood creates for us, or through newsreel footage. And in these cases, what we tend to find is that there were at least apparently clear-cut differences between friends and enemies, combatants and non-combatants, and importantly, the times and locations where you are at war and the times and locations when you're not at war.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
How does this rubric fit with modern conflict? Let's take, for example, the 9/11 attacks on the United States in 2001. Now just imagine for a second that the 19 years of history that have passed by since then didn't happen. And we're on that day and we're trying to interpret what's going on. Can we ask ourselves, is this war? Or is this a criminal action? If it's a criminal action, similar for instance to the Oklahoma bombing,
a massive explosion at the federal building in the center of the city,
then the correct response is to respond to it with a police action. We already have structures and institutions set up within our societies to deal with crimes exactly like this. However, if this is an act of war, more like, for instance, Pearl Harbor or the Blitz, then the required response is very different.
In times of war, there are things that we consider immoral and illegal in times of peace that we consider moral, legal, and good, praiseworthy in times of war.
Of course, a lot of history has happened since that fateful day, and a lot of people have made similar observations that the nature of our response depends on our interpretation. And in many cases, there are some very ugly lines that we can draw between the nature of state responses and pre-existing prejudices, where very similar looking actions at first glance are treated very differently by the state.
It seems as though white men invoking white supremacy and engaging in mass shootings are almost immune from being labeled domestic terrorists in their violence.
But this problem hasn't gone away, nor can it be simply wished away. In some cases, state actors have deliberately sought to manipulate this grey area. So what Brooks does in this book is to take those paradoxes and rather simply point them out or wring her hands about them, she treats them as an entry point for analysing the relevant policy and institutions involved in dealing with them, and in so doing finds that while a lot of the response is deeply unsatisfying, the reality is that the problem of these paradoxes itself isn't going anywhere.
We're trapped in something of a vicious circle where as we face novel security threats, transnational non-state terrorism, threats from cyberspace, threats that emanate from poverty, repression, climate change, we've gotten into the habit in the post-9/11 world of viewing all threats through the lens of war, and we ask our military then to take on an ever-expanding range of non-traditional tasks.
So the book itself deals with these blurred lines of peace and war through examining 7 different areas of US national security policy. Obviously we can't cover all these in what is meant to be a 10-minute video, so I'll stick to droning on about just one. So most viewers will be aware of the use of drones or unmanned aerial vehicles as a tool for prosecuting wars that has increased dramatically in its usage over the past 20 years. Most famously and controversially as a tool used by the United States to kill its enemies or perceived threat in the context of the war on terror. But in reality, the use of these weapons has spread into much wider contexts and have been adopted by many other states and not just US allies. Brooks notes that for most people we don't know much about them, how they operate, what laws or rules govern their use. For the most part, the criticisms that tend to float around the question of drones revolve around issues about whether they're a dishonorable way of waging war.
Talk about civilian casualties, anxieties about the so-called sort of video game type killing qualities that they seem to enable, and worry about whether this leads to a sort of moral disconnect from killing. I'm going to suggest that those are mostly red herrings.
She says the real trouble with drones revolves around what they do to muddy this relationship between war and peace even further.
They reduce the perceived costs of using lethal force, particularly across borders outside of traditional battlefields. And so I do think it reduces that threshold for the decision to use force in foreign countries in a way that just makes it a little bit more tempting.
Furthermore, the institutional damage of drone warfare is rooted in the epidemic of secrecy which revolves around the drone program. She says this can be extremely damaging to American democracy, essentially because it undermines any system of accountability that had previously existed. In fact, Brooks says, we don't know the targeting criteria or whether the rules for CIA and military drone strikes differ. We don't know the details of the internal process through which targets are vetted. We don't know the chain of command or the details of congressional oversight. The United States does not release the names of those killed or the locations or number of strikes, making it impossible to know whether those killed were legitimately viewed as combatants or not. We don't know the cost of the secret war. How much money has been spent on the drone strike? What's the budget for related targeting and intelligence infrastructures? How is the government assessing the cost and benefits of counter-terrorism drone strikes? That's a lot of secrecy for a targeted killing program that has reportedly caused the deaths of several thousand people. So what does this all mean? Well, we've known for thousands of years that defining the phenomena of war and peace is incredibly difficult. But most societies throughout history have also known that there must be a dividing line between the two.
For most of human history, human societies have tried really, really hard to draw sharp lines between the worlds of war and the world of peace, between the role of the warrior and the role of the civilian. The Old Norse berserkers, who give us our modern word berserk, were warriors who would don the pelts of predatory animals like wolves and bears. They believed that they became predatory animals themselves and took on the attributes of those vicious predators in battle. The Navajo of the American Southwest literally spoke a different language when they went off to war. The Makeo of Papua New Guinea, other things, they had to abstain from certain foods and abstain from sexual relations with their wives. Obviously, when you think of the ways in which new recruits in many Western militaries are still treated, we still put them through types of initiation rituals.
And what's the reason for this? Because it's been known for all this time that war is toxic, and if it's allowed to seep into our society more generally, then that toxicity will spread.
The brutality that is permitted and even applauded in times of war is a type of brutality that is often literally conceptualized as toxic to ordinary community life, as a poison in ordinary community life.
And in some ways, Brooks reflects the arguments made by Kagan and Walt, as discussed in our previous videos, about how this current age, since the Second World War, is remarkably different from what preceded. In fact, she argues since 1949, huge institutional apparatus has been built explicitly to assert and develop an international legal framework to apply to modern warfare, to keep modern warfare and its toxicity in a box. However, to some degree, this process, at least in Brooks' view, has indirectly added to the murkiness by highlighting the paradoxes inherent in the relationship between states, war and law, by challenging concepts such as sovereignty through principles like responsibility to protect or the Convention Against Genocide. These principles demand action in defense of human rights, even in cases where the perpetrators of these abuses are generally recognized as the legal sovereign authority. What Brooks is primarily concerned with how the United States behaves. And for her, the great danger is that if the US acts in such a way as to exploit the grey area between peace and war, often stretching legal precedents to a point at which they're almost unrecognisable, then there will likely be dire consequences for the United States itself. For example, the US executive branch still justifies its war on terror military campaigns through an act of Congress that was passed in 2001, which explicitly identifies legitimate targets as Al-Qaeda and its associated forces. But who is an associated force? Can you realistically expect anyone to believe that the assassination of Qasem Suliemani, an Iranian general, can be justified on the basis that he was an associated force of Al-Qaeda? If these rules don't really matter to states like the United States, then she asks us to think about what the consequences of this might be in the long run. Do we want to live in a world in which every state considers itself to have the legal right to kill people in other states, secretly and with no public disclosure or due process? The consequences go beyond that, and the toxicity seeps into other areas of our lives. Like, for instance, the militarization of the domestic sphere, or the massive growth of state surveillance apparatus. We should look at the opportunity cost of always prioritizing defense and security above myriad other concerns, which by any common sense measure should also matter a great deal to governments. But Brooks says these problems aren't going anywhere. And neither is the fact that the nature of war is always changing. There are very real threats to our lives and our way of life that come from outside, but they also come from within. So what do we do about that? Unless we want to live in a world where everything really does become war, then we need to start adapting our rules and institutions to cope. For Brooks, there's two big prongs to this. For a start, the institution, particularly the military. Given its outsized role in American foreign policy these days, the military must be able to adapt to do more and do it effectively.
Well, if the military is going to be doing all these different kinds of things, let's figure out how to make them good at it.
And the other prong is about attitude. Brooks says political leaders must stop playing the game of law in order to stretch and bend the truth to do what they want. And this requires courage. She looks back at previous landmark events.
The creation of the ICRC and the Geneva Conventions, and the codification of international humanitarian law. Did it help? Yes, it helped. Did it always help? No. Did it often help? Yes. And I think that we are at another one of those moments.
So in essence, what Brooks says is that after 9/11, war broke out of this box that had been built to contain it in the aftermath of World War II, and we can't very easily put it back in again. If we don't try to control it, our international order and our lives may very well start to resemble the human condition in much grimmer and more unstable periods of our species' history. This book obviously raises a whole host of incredibly difficult questions and doesn't really give us many answers. Of course, you don't have to agree with Brooks' argument. I certainly have reservations around quite a bit of it, but I do think the questions she raises can't be ignored. Neither can the hard truths that many of these paradoxes aren't going anywhere, as much as we might wish them away. Anyway, leave me a comment down below, tell me what you think. If you like this video, please like. If you loved it, subscribe. And if you've got any friends or colleagues who might be interested in this topic, please pass this video along to them, and I'll see you next time.